Good morning, my friends. Today I want to remind you of a truth that can transform how you face every challenge, every mountain, and every storm in your life. God will provide. Now, I don't know what you're dealing with right now. Maybe it's financial stress. Maybe it's a health crisis. Maybe you're battling doubts that keep you up at night or fears that whisper you're not going to make it. But let me tell you something. God knows exactly what you need, and He has already prepared the provision for your situation. God's knowledge and preparation for our needs is an unshakable truth. Long before we even encounter a challenge, God has already prepared the solution. He is omniscient, meaning He knows every detail of our lives, past, present, and future. No situation surprises Him, and no need is beyond His ability to meet. When we face difficult moments, it's easy to feel like we're on our own, but the reality is that God has gone ahead of us. He sees the end from the beginning, and His provision is already set in place, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. This assurance of God's preparation is deeply tied to faith. Faith is not merely a passive hope for better circumstances, it's an active trust in the character and promises of God. When we step out in faith, even when we cannot see the full picture, we position ourselves to receive what God has already prepared for us. Faith is what moves us from fear into alignment with God's plan. It allows us to trust that He will provide exactly what we need, exactly when we need it. Obedience is often the path to unlocking God's provision. Consider Abraham, who was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac in obedience to God's command. Even though the situation seemed impossible, Abraham trusted that God would provide. And God did at the very moment it was needed. This story reminds us that our steps of faith and obedience often activate God's provision. It's in the moments when we let go of our own understanding and lean fully on God that we experience His miraculous interventions. Instead of worrying about how our needs will be met, we are called to trust in God. Worry adds nothing to our lives and takes away our peace, but trusting God restores our confidence and allows us to walk boldly. The how of provision is not for us to figure out, it's for God to handle. Our role is to believe that He is faithful to His promises and able to meet our every need. God's provision is not always obvious. It might come in a form we don't expect or appear at a time we didn't anticipate. Sometimes it's hidden like the ram caught in the thicket, or disguised as something ordinary, a resource, a relationship, or a small opportunity. Recognizing God's provision requires faith to see beyond the surface and trust that He is working behind the scenes. Every example of God's provision is a testament to His care for creation. If He clothes the lilies in beauty and feeds the sparrows daily, how much more will He provide for us, His beloved children? We can live with the assurance that our needs matter deeply to Him and that His provision is always perfect and timely. Faith is the cornerstone of receiving God's provision. It is more than wishful thinking or a vague sense of optimism. It is a deep, unwavering trust in God's character and His promises. Faith challenges us to believe that God is working on our behalf, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. It is what keeps us moving forward when logic says to stop, and what inspires us to hold on when giving up feels easier. Faith opens the door to provision by aligning our hearts with God's will and reminding us that His resources are infinite, His timing is perfect, and His ways are higher than ours. In moments of uncertainty, faith requires us to take steps without knowing the outcome. This is not blind risk, but a deliberate act of trust in a faithful God. Abraham's story is a powerful example of this principle. When asked to sacrifice his son Isaac, he didn't hesitate, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he trusted that God's plan was good, even if he couldn't see it in the moment. Abraham's faith wasn't just intellectual, it was active and obedient. He walked up the mountain, prepared the altar, and raised the knife, trusting that somehow God would provide. And in the critical moment, God revealed the ram in the thicket. This story reminds us that faith doesn't demand all the answers up front. It simply believes that God is faithful to His word and acts accordingly. Trusting in God's provision also requires letting go of the need to control or understand every detail of how our needs will be met. Often the temptation is to analyze, plan, and strategize until we exhaust ourselves trying to find solutions. But provision is not something we achieve, it is something we receive. The Bible teaches us to trust God completely, not partially. It tells us to lean not on our own understanding, but to acknowledge Him in all our ways. Trust shifts the burden from our shoulders to His, freeing us from the anxiety of trying to figure out every step on our own. Trust also means releasing our expectations of how provision should look. God's ways are often surprising, and His provision may come from unexpected sources. It could be hidden in the form of a skill we've overlooked, a relationship we've undervalued, or a door we didn't think to open. Trust teaches us to keep our eyes on God and not the circumstances, knowing that His provision will always align with His purpose for our lives. Through trust, we gain not only what we need, but also the peace and confidence that come from relying on a God who never fails. God's provision often comes in ways that meet us precisely at the moment of obedience. This is a truth that unfolds repeatedly in the stories of faith throughout the Bible. Obedience is not just about following a command, it is about surrendering to God's will and trusting Him with the outcome. When Abraham walked up the mountain with Isaac, he didn't know how God would resolve the situation. Yet he acted in obedience, believing in God's promise and faithfulness. His obedience created the space for God's provision to manifest. The ram in the thicket was not just a solution, it was a revelation of God's faithfulness. Similarly, when we step out in obedience, even when the path is unclear, we position ourselves to receive the blessings and solutions God has prepared for us. Obedience often requires us to move beyond our comfort zones. It challenges us to act on faith rather than fear, to trust God even when the instructions seem illogical or difficult. The widow of Zarephath in the story of Elijah faced a seemingly impossible request. With only a handful of flour and a little oil, she was asked to prepare a meal for the prophet before feeding herself and her son. Her obedience to that request unlocked a miracle. Her supply of flour and oil did not run dry throughout the famine. This example illustrates that God's provision often waits on the other side of a step of faith. It is in the doing, the giving, and the trusting that we experience His faithfulness in unexpected ways. God's provision is not limited to grand, miraculous acts. It often comes through the ordinary, disguised in forms we may not immediately recognize. Provision is sometimes hidden in relationships, opportunities, or resources we already have but have overlooked. It takes faith and a heart attuned to God's voice to see these hidden blessings for what they are. The 5 loaves and 2 fish offered by the boy to Jesus seemed insufficient to feed a multitude. Yet in Jesus' hands, they became more than enough. This teaches us that what we consider small or insignificant can be multiplied in ways that surpass our expectations when entrusted to God. Provision also aligns with God's perfect timing. It may not come when we want or in the way we expect, but it always comes at the right moment. The Israelites wandering in the desert received manna daily, a provision that taught them to depend on God one day at a time. This daily dependence built their trust in Him as their ultimate provider. Likewise, our own reliance on God deepens when we learn to trust His timing and His methods, knowing that He is never late and always faithful. God's provision is a reflection of His omniscience and His deep care for us. Long before we encounter challenges, God is already at work preparing the solution. This truth is evident throughout Scripture and in our own lives. He knows the trials we will face, the doubts we will wrestle with, and the needs we will have, and He orchestrates events in ways that demonstrate His foresight and love. When we feel uncertain or overwhelmed, we can find comfort in knowing that God is not surprised by our circumstances. His provision is not reactive, it is proactive, perfectly timed, and specifically tailored to meet our needs in ways we often cannot foresee. Faith is the key that opens the door to God's provision. Faith is more than belief, it is active trust in God's character and promises. It asks us to step forward even when the path is unclear, to obey even when the outcome is uncertain. Faith is not about having all the answers, but about trusting the one who does. Abraham's journey with Isaac to the mountain is a profound example of this. He didn't know how God would provide, but he believed that He would. This belief allowed Abraham to act in obedience, which led to God revealing the ram in the thicket at the perfect moment. Faith moves us beyond our fears and doubts and positions us to receive God's blessings in His way and His time. Trusting in God's provision requires us to release control. We often want to understand how everything will work out, but God calls us to lean not on our own understanding. Trust is about letting go of our need to know every detail and instead resting in the assurance that God is faithful. This trust frees us from the anxiety of trying to figure out every solution ourselves, allows us to live with confidence, knowing that God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating everything for our good. Trust also helps us to remain steadfast when the provision seems delayed or comes in ways we do not expect. God's provision is often hidden in the ordinary. It may come in the form of a small opportunity, a resource we've overlooked, or a relationship we hadn't considered. Recognizing these moments requires a heart attuned to God's voice and a willingness to see beyond the surface. Just as Jesus multiplied the loaves and fishes, transforming an ordinary lunch into a feast for thousands, God can take what seems insignificant and turn it into more than enough. His provision is not only timely but also abundant, reminding us that He is a God of overflow and generosity. God's provision begins with His perfect knowledge of our lives. He is never caught off guard by the challenges we face, and His solutions are already in motion before we even recognize the need. This divine preparation demonstrates not only His power, but also His love for us. He knows every detail of our circumstances, our struggles, fears, and desires, and He cares deeply about them. Trusting in this truth allows us to face uncertainties with confidence, knowing that God's provision is not an afterthought, but an intentional part of His plan for us. His timing and methods may not always align with our expectations, but they are always perfect. Faith is the foundation upon which God's provision often manifests. Faith goes beyond intellectual agreement. It is active and alive, requiring us to step forward in trust, even when the path ahead seems unclear. Abraham's willingness to offer his son Isaac is a powerful testament to this principle. His faith in God's ability to provide gave him the courage to obey without hesitation. In that moment of obedience, God revealed the ram in the thicket, showing that His provision was already prepared. This story reminds us that faith is not about having all the answers, but about trusting the one who does. It is through faith that we align ourselves with God's purpose and unlock the blessings He has already set in place for us. Obedience is often the bridge between faith and provision. Acting on God's instructions, even when they seem difficult or illogical, creates space for Him to work in our lives. The widow of Zarephath, who gave her last bin of flour and oil to Elijah during a famine, experienced this firsthand. Her obedience, though sacrificial, resulted in a miracle. The flour and oil never ran out. This illustrates that God's provision is not limited by scarcity, but is activated by trust and obedience. When we move in faith, we create opportunities for God's power to be revealed in ways that defy human logic. Trusting in God's provision also involves releasing the need to control or understand every detail. It means surrendering our plans and embracing God's will, even when it feels uncomfortable. Trust shifts our focus from our limitations to God's limitless resources. This shift allows us to live in peace, knowing that God's provision will always come at the right time and in the right way. Often God's provision is hidden in the ordinary. It may come through a relationship, an opportunity, or a resource we already possess but haven't recognized as significant. Like the boy's loaves and fish that Jesus multiplied to feed thousands, what seems small in our hands can become abundant in God's. This reminds us that God is not only a provider but also a multiplier, capable of turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. Recognizing His provision requires faith to see beyond appearances and trust in His ability to transform even the smallest offerings into more than enough. God's provision is rooted in His infinite knowledge and love. Before we even recognize our needs, God is already at work preparing a solution that aligns with His perfect plan. This truth is evident throughout the Bible and in our daily lives. Nothing takes God by surprise. He sees the end from the beginning, and His provision is carefully tailored to meet our needs in ways that we may not initially understand. Trusting this truth allows us to face life's uncertainties with confidence, knowing that God is never late and always faithful. His provision may not come in the way or time we expect, but it always arrives at the moment we need it most. Faith is the key that unlocks God's provision. Faith goes beyond hope or positive thinking. It is an active trust in God's promises and His ability to fulfill them. This kind of faith often requires action, even when the outcome is uncertain. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac demonstrates this principle. He didn't wait for clarity or assurances, he obeyed because he believed in God's faithfulness. His act of faith revealed God's provision, a ram caught in the thicket waiting to take Isaac's place. Faith positions us to receive God's blessings and helps us align with his purposes even when the journey feels unclear or challenging. Obedience is often the channel through which God's provision flows. It requires stepping out in faith and following God's instructions even when they seem difficult or counterintuitive. The widow of Zarephath, facing a famine, gave her last meal to Elijah as an act of obedience. Her willingness to trust God resulted in a miracle. Her supply of flour and oil did not run out. This story reminds us that provision is not tied to our circumstances, but to our willingness to trust and obey. Obedience creates space for God to demonstrate his power and faithfulness in ways that exceed our expectations. Trusting in God's provision involves surrendering our need for control. It means letting go of our plans and placing our confidence in his ability to provide. Trust shifts our perspective from anxiety and self-reliance to peace and dependence on God. This trust is not passive but active, requiring us to lean on his promises and believe that he will meet every need according to his perfect will. It frees us from the weight of worry and allows us to live with confidence in God's unfailing care. God's provision often comes disguised in ordinary things. It may appear in the form of relationships, opportunities, or resources we overlook because they seem insignificant. The 5 loaves and 2 fish offered by a young boy seemed insufficient, but in Jesus' hands they fed thousands. This illustrates how God can take what seems small or inadequate and multiply it to meet the need. Recognizing his provision requires faith to see beyond appearances and trust in his ability to turn the ordinary into the extraordinary.